much more like if you were to walk into an engineering lab and write up a lab report. So, so there are some variations, but this is the one that you're most likely to see on most EPICS teams. Are there any questions about this document? Okay. All right. Now, I want to do handouts. Okay. There's a couple of handouts that will be useful to you. This guide is called, the URL is, let me type it out, guides.lib.purdue.edu/EPICS-PA. That. And it has a tab on it called Handouts. And so these are files that I have uploaded that are the supplementary files for this particular role. So you can go and you can get them. It does have the best practices document, which I think is among the most helpful documents. And again, this document was created by the former project archivists coming back and just reporting what they did that worked, that they thought was useful. So one of the things that I think that is very helpful is you do need to get on the same page with your team project manager or your team leader and your advisor on what they want for you as the project archivist to do. Because some teams are huge. So, I mean, this is not the biggest team that I've ever had, but this semester we have 16 students on EII. And so one project archivist is probably not going to be able to do everything on that team. And instead, we will probably have a project archivist for each of the smaller teams, right? So we have 4 teams, 16 students. So we'll probably have 4 project archivists. So talk to your advisor and your team leader to see how they want to handle the documentation load. There's no reason for one person to handle all of the documentation work for a very large team. Now, if there's a team of 5 students, one person is probably appropriate, right? So just talk to them and negotiate. One thing to think about is talking about goals for documentation in PIG along with goals for the project. So just making it very explicit in your team. What are your goals going to be for getting your documentation reported out? That way it's just an accepted fact of the team that people are going to be working on it. Because if it's out of sight, out of mind, it's not going to get done. So anyway, there's lots and lots of ideas on this document. I'm not going to read it to you. One thing to be aware of is SharePoint can both make life easier and make life a whole hell of a lot worse. And depending on what it's doing this semester, it could go either way. So if you're having trouble with SharePoint, talk to your TA. You can also come talk to me. SharePoint has some backup features and has some renaming features that can be really useful. So if you have the opportunity, I believe there is a SharePoint skill session. If you take the SharePoint skill session, or maybe online at this point, like they may have videotaped it. If you have the opportunity to take it, do that, because there's some tools that'll be really useful for you. Okay. The other handout that's here are the design process-centered activities. So depending on where you are in the design process, there are different practical skills activities that can be useful with developing documentation and pushing your project forward through to the design life cycle. And so I've written them up in this document. And so in case your team is wondering what to do at a point in the design life cycle, you can suggest these activities. Okay. Sometimes when teams are getting started, actually this is most common for them not to know really what to do. And so there's an environmental scan that is suggested. There's a skills identification activity. There's an infrastructure setup activity under the problem identification stage. There's a personas identification activity under specification identity or identification. Project partner interview, a design matrix. So anyway, all of these are available to you. You can take a look at them, and they may be helpful to you as well. Okay. All right, so the key to all of these is to identify the stage of your design cycle for your project, because there's documentation at all stages of the design life cycle, but there's some special documentation that happens at specific times of the design life cycle. So just be aware of that, particularly when you're getting your project just started up. You need to document all of the decisions, all of the prior art and benchmarking that you do during the conceptual art and specification design phases. All of that needs to go in the documentation. And so that part of the design process is particularly design heavy, and unfortunately that's a part of the project that often gets overlooked in the design documentation. Okay. I did warn you about non-standard design documents, but these are relatively common. Talk to your advisors, and there are some that are based on industry standards. There's some that are based on research-based templates. Either way, EPICS has not laid the smack down, so it doesn't matter what they look like as long as there is a design document that is produced and handed over to the external design reviewers. So just make sure really early in the semester, like this week, you communicate with your advisors about what design document you're going to be using, because you want to know what you're going to be working towards throughout the semester. Like, you don't want to be using the EPICS design template and then like right before mid-semester design review, have the advisors be like, no, we're not using that template, we're using this other thing over here, right? You want to know that from the beginning, so just communicate about that right away. Okay, the keys to documentation, you want to know what the decision was, and then it's really important to know what the context of that decision was. I can't stress that enough. You almost have to explain the decision, explain it again, and then when you think you've got it clearly explained, hand it to a friend, and then make sure that they can explain it back to you. I mean, it's not quite that bad, but it almost is, because you're not only explaining it to yourself and the people around you who are on the team and living that design, you're explaining it to the future design teams, and then you're explaining it to the end users as well, because they are the ones who are going to be using the user documentation. So even if you haven't started writing the user documentation yet, whatever design decisions you're writing in that documentation are going to influence what that user documentation says. So it's really important to be thorough in the documentation. Include standards, literature searches, drawings, sketches, notebooks, code snippets. Include anything that went into influencing the design decision. And anything that provided context for ultimately deciding to create something the way it was. And when I say anything, like particularly in the conceptual design phase, right at the beginning, you really need to provide that context for how you decided and landed on those decisions. You want it all to be measurable and observable. So it can be something very basic. How did you decide to go metric versus standard? I don't think I've ever seen a team document how they made that decision. But it's fundamental, right? Like, how did that decision get made? I don't know. You know, most teams are just like, the tools we had sitting in the lab were in standard, so therefore standard, right? You know, those types of fundamental decisions are crucial, though, to the specifications that you ultimately develop, right? And then visual displays of information whenever possible, because the human brain takes in visual information more efficiently. Charts, graphs, drawings, decision matrices, those are all very useful. Okay. Any questions so far? Yes?
Will these slides be made available to us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they'll be on that website that I showed you a little bit earlier. Yeah. All right. When you're disrupting documentation, which is basically convincing people to write documentation, focus on your teammates and make sure that your teammates are, if not on board, at least understand the context of why you're asking them to create documentation. We're not asking them to create documentation because it's just more homework. EPICS is not like any other classes that you're taking here. A lot of the classes that you're taking here on campus, they're handing you problems, they're asking you to solve them, you turn them in. At the end of the semester, maybe they go into the homework files for the frats, but other than that, you don't really have to think about those homework problems anymore, right? EPICS, this project is going to have an ongoing life once you leave this class, because the project is going to go live in the community. That documentation is important. It is not like the other homework that you are doing. It's not for your own, just for your own knowledge. It is for other people to be able to experience that project as well, right? Momentum matters. So if you can get some momentum at the beginning of the semester behind people doing documentation a little bit at a time, for instance, doing a PIG update on documentation every week, that will make it easier for everyone to do documentation throughout the semester. It's just like any other habit. If you can do it a little bit at a time, it feels a whole lot easier than doing a whole bunch at the end. That feels like a much bigger lift. And that's the reason that the Google form, I think, was so successful for the teams that implemented it, because it didn't feel like a huge burden. It was click on the form, do a little bit of text, maybe upload an image, move on with my life, right? That's not a huge ask. So it's that sort of small implementations of change that you're trying to work into your team's culture, and trying to figure out how you can do that in a way that respects your team's culture, but at the same time achieves the goal of getting some documentation in there is what you're trying to get at. Authority and influence don't derive from your role, but from your action and impact. So you're setting the example of documentation on your team as the project archivist. So you can talk about documentation, but if people don't actually see you producing documentation, then there's not going to be a whole lot of impact. If people don't see you leading discussions about the documentation, there's not going to be a whole lot of impact. So that's just leadership 101, right? And then authority and influence is there for the taking if you can solve your teammates' problems. Now this one's actually easier than it sounds. Your teammates are graded on their documentation. Your teammates have a fundamental problem. They need documentation at the middle of the semester and the end of the semester. You are there and you are helping them to get a better grade. You're solving their problem. How are you solving their problem? That is what you're trying to figure out as the project archivist, right? You're also helping to solve the problem of how do we deliver this project faster and with better quality at the same time. All right, so we have very little time left, like 3 minutes to think through some questions. So what are going to be some signs of good documentation on your team? Yeah. Yeah, so if there's explanation for why they did certain things or why they picked certain tasks. Someone who didn't do it or wasn't involved on the team can understand it, yeah. Yeah.
Things are easy to find.
Things are easy to find, yes. Yep.
Things are kind of coherent and consistent. It's
The-
easy to understand.
Things are coherent and consistent. They're easy to understand. Yep. Is there another one? Yeah.
Create like a timeline of what happened.
You can create a timeline of what happened. Absolutely. Okay. So what are some signs of weak documentation that you have seen so far in your time of EPICS? Yeah.
It's not there.
It's not there. It's just missing. Makes you want to bang your head against a blackboard. Yeah.
Google Drive is super convoluted. It's hard to find where stuff is.
Google Drive is super convoluted and it's hard to find anything. Yep. Yep.
Lack of detail.
Lack of detail. Just don't know what it's referring to or the context. Yep. Okay. What suggestions would you make to a team that submitted poor documentation? Yeah.
Don't wait until the last minute.
Do not wait until the last minute. Yeah. Any others? Okay. Some other suggestions for a team with poor documentation. Hand your documentation to a friend and have them read it and give feedback. Include lots of visuals for your documentation and then give captions of those visuals to provide the context for them. And then explain the decision points. So just go through the documentation, identify what those decision points are, and then explain why those decisions were made and how they were made. Okay. All right. Let's see. All right, your turn. Just ask me questions. We'll skip the last two. Yes.
Are you going to be around like during kind of our meeting times, I guess, for us to like come ask you questions? Or like when can we come talk to you?
Okay, so my office hours are on Monday afternoon. Okay, my office hours are Monday afternoon from 1:30 until 3, and Thursday morning from 10 to noon. And my office is in Walk 3053E, 3053E. So you can also email me at msn@purdue.edu, and I will be happy to make an appointment with you. My team meets on Wednesdays from 3:30 to 5:20, so that's when I'm actually over here normally. But I'm happy to meet and consult with teams, particularly those of you who are like, our Google Drive sucks and I can't find anything. I can help you reorganize the Google Drive and things like that. Okay. All right, I have to wrap it up. So that's fine. I will be happy to stay after and answer any questions that you have. And I look forward to seeing you later this semester for the documentation peer review sessions. Okay? that's fine.
A lot of times when we don't have the second mic, we usually have you guys repeat it. But, I mean, you got
okay.
your point
Okay.
across. I just fine, so
Oh,
I
okay.
apologize, but I
Oh,
was
no,
just
that's fine.
basically saying repeat the question.
Oh,